The impact Shakespeare has had on the world is immense. Over the course of his life, Shakespeare authored 38 plays and introduced almost 3,000 words into the English language. While being regarded as one of the best writers ever, much of Shakespeare's personal beliefs are playfully hidden behind rich characters who force their audience to identify and weigh moral questions. Are there good and bad tyrants? Can people find redemption? What happens when people succumb to jealousy, greed, or covet power? How should Shakespeare be read in today's world? Are there political themes that can be gleaned to help guide modern statesmen? I wanted to ask my next guest, Dr. Nicolas McAfee. Nick is a postdoctoral teaching fellow at the Center for Thomas More Studies at the University of Dallas. Nick's first book, Political Wisdom in Late Shakespeare, A Way Out of the Wreck, comes out this summer. In addition to this, Nick is in fact my brother. Join us as we discuss Shakespeare, Thomas More, and the path that lies ahead. Thanks for joining us today, guys, and thank you, Nicolas, for being here with me today. We're currently in Los Angeles. Both of us are on a vacation, as it were, from our respective places of business, and so with that, yeah, it's good to be back here. I don't know if you've spent much time in Los Angeles yourself. You're more of a San Diego guy by association.
Yeah, no, I mean, even just today, it's such a gorgeous day. I don't know, maybe LA's trying to swing me in a more favorable direction. I think back in the day, I used to tell people I didn't mind if it fell into the ocean. So sorry, LA goers. There are some beautiful things.
I think that's a fair opinion. Earlier, we got blasted with some rain, so I'm really happy to see that it cleared up here.
Sure.
But so yeah, let's jump right into it. Let's start at the beginning of your sort of background, your intro into politics. Yeah, tell us a little bit about your background and when you first became interested in the subject of philosophy. For a lot of people, maybe it starts when they're in university, but for you, I would guess it started earlier. Maybe you were in high school debate, you became familiar with some of these early philosophers. Tell me a little about that.
Wow, yeah, okay. So, to go back to high school, yeah, I was in policy debate in high school. Which I would not say is the best introduction to philosophic questions. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was good for me. It taught me a lot about how to think on your feet quickly, how to analyze arguments for kind of weak points. It was good. I got to travel, which was a great gift. But I was definitely introduced to a lot of what contemporary, kind of pop culture might consider philosophers, especially postmodern philosophers, in part because, our form of debate that you also did was dominated by college institutions, right? A lot of the debate turnouts were being hosted at universities that had their own debate programs. Coaches were college debaters in many cases, judges, right?
Yeah.
And I think it was in the 90s, if my history is correct, that the rise of inserting postmodern philosophy, those critiques into debate rounds, typically as a negative argument, but that changed. There was the affirmative and the negative teams, right? You're always one or the other. That meant that all of a sudden you had these high schoolers trying to talk about Friedrich Nietzsche and Michel Foucault, and I'm not sure they really ever exhibited much understanding of kind of the depth of some of these thinkers, but they had college kids who were really fired up about, criticizing capitalism from a new angle or an old angle. And that meant that at a minimum, I was exposed to a kind of lifestyle that frankly was, on the part of some of my debate teammates and some of the wider community, was surprisingly kind of hedonistic. There was a lot of drugs, a lot of sex, and alcohol. And I was struck by how so many very brilliant people just felt kind of going off the rails a little bit. It certainly wasn't a very attractive lifestyle as a kind of curmudgeonly high schooler who was just coming out of his shell. But I definitely felt like there was an invitation in high school to the life of the mind. I feel really indebted to one of my sophomore high school theology teacher had us read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, which, of course, for those who don't know, was a transcription of, I believe, wartime World War II radio broadcasts that C.S. Lewis delivered to the British people. And of course, he treats, if my memory serves, he treats a lot of the question of why is there something noble and just in England's kind of Christian combat of sorts with some of the ideologies behind the Third Reich. But it just, to me, was like one of those first serious, sober encounters of Christianity being a cradle Catholic. I didn't have some kind of crazy struggle of faith, but for the first time, I heard a really powerful, rational, kind of humor-filled, but it was at least lighthearted way of articulating this is a way of life worth living, and a source of happiness, where I was starting to be exposed to other lifestyles that struck me as a little hollow, a little less than happy. So that the life of the mind was something C.S. Lewis kind of opened up a little bit. But it wasn't until college, went to a tiny Catholic film and business school that, of course, you yourself are familiar with. John Paul the Great.
I don't know anything about
Catholic University in Escondido. It's in North County, San Diego, California. Had some great philosophy and theology teachers there. I went as a screenwriting student.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, talk about that a little bit, because you've also had a deep admiration for theater for as long as I can remember. You were also very active in the drama program in high school, which at a certain point it began to feel to me like your heart was more there than in the debate world. But you formally made a kind of switch at the university level from being initially a screenwriting student to switching over to theology. So if you wouldn't mind talking about that a little bit.
Yeah, it was a kind of funny zigzag. So you're right, like beginning of freshman year and end of kind of my senior year around the kind of debate stuff. And high school was when I did enjoy acting. Obviously there were a lot of little acting opportunities through school, in elementary school and whatnot. But yeah, I knew I wanted to do some kind of creative writing of some kind. And sat in a class at JP Catholic with, I believe he's still there, Chris Riley, the main screenwriting professor. Really great teacher as well as a great screenwriter. And yeah, it just seemed like a really fun place, an engaged place. I wasn't accredited at the time, so there's kind of this kind of almost entrepreneurial spirit about it. But I realized, maybe a little bit slower than I would have liked, that I was not as creative, I guess, as I would have liked. I had a much more editorial mind, I think I discovered in college. So I enjoyed marking up other people's scripts, all the red ink.
You enjoyed consuming the content more than maybe producing it? Well,
that can be a big sort of fallacy. I love watching movies, so therefore I would love making them. I do see that. I think it was more of, I did not have a good writing style, approach to writing, rather. My process was never pinned down, and I was incredibly perfectionistic when it came to it really slowed me down. And so I was realizing that I was enjoying, right, at this Catholic school we had theology, philosophy classes in a little core. I was enjoying the papers I was writing for those classes, and frankly I just thought they were better quality pieces of writing than the scripts that I was slowly, ponderously working through. Don't get me wrong, there's some really fun, if you've ever been on a film set, right, it can be a really exciting, collaborative energy in those atmospheres, just like being in a play.
It can feel magical.
Yeah, sure. So I'm not trying to downplay the real gifts of the film core that I did, but yeah, it was one of those things where I had started getting mentorship from a theology professor at John Paul the Great, John Kincaid, who's now at the University of Mary in Bismarck, North Dakota, great guy. And he was a biblical theologian, so he was especially focusing on the writings of St. Paul in the Bible. And at the time at JP Catholic, there was a MA in theology program, and as I was approaching kind of the end of my senior year, I was like, I think I'm just called more in this a more academic direction. And again, like I said, it seemed like the fruits of those classes were just a lot more higher quality, more enriching. We were talking to my girlfriend then at the time about how I was going to go to this Bible conference that was happening in San Diego. The Society for Biblical Literature, the kind of big academic guild conference, was in San Diego that year, 2014. Really enjoyed it. It was a whole new kind of energy. And so I started taking grad level theology classes my senior year, and then immediately transitioned into the 2-year MA in biblical theology at JV Catholic. Had a good time. It was really good, but somehow I ended up in politics still. So I don't know if we want to do that final zag. I'm trying to cover ground as quickly as possible.
Well, I mean,
but
the big,
it is,
yeah. Well, and so to go with that, I mean, when does Shakespeare appear for you in a significant way? Because we're going to talk a lot about some of his plays that may bear political or moral significance, particularly to you. But what first sort of drew you in to thinking about Shakespeare in a political lens?
Yeah, sure. So it's definitely true that there was a part of my imagination. I remember fondly some of the times I was exposed to Shakespeare in like junior high at first, like kind of Much Ado About Nothing. I remember watching 10 Things I Hate About You and some of the kind of like Taming the Shrew adaptation. I remember enjoying my first reading of Shakespeare in school, but it definitely didn't captivate me the way that the two kind of big things that made me more seriously interested were taking a playing Shakespeare class with Lear at John Paul the Great. Fantastic class. It focused a lot on the playing Shakespeare little BBC miniseries that was done. I forget the director's name. I think it might have been John Barton. I believe he's passed away recently. But it was, I believe, recorded in the 80s, maybe 70s, 80s, and it had a bunch of A-list actors and actresses on film workshopping Shakespeare scenes. So we're talking like Patrick Stewart, Judi Dench, Ian McKellen, and Lee Eske in that class helped me see how much was kind of hiding under every little like, how many little implicit stage directions are in Shakespeare's plays, how the meter and a host of other little details are hints, clues, things for actors to discover and make thoughtful choices, thoughtful interpretations about how they're going to use this text. But it showed me that these texts, these plays, were really thick. There were a lot of layers to them. If you threw questions at them, there were answers that you could find. They could withstand good questioning. And I've always felt like that's kind of a measure of like really great works of art, but especially works of literature, is some things are just kind of shallow. And you ask questions about like, why did this character do that? Or is that a plot hole? And if it doesn't have, if the work's kind of shallow, it won't withstand much kind of questioning. It's not worth asking questions of. So that was really important. And then the other thing was when I was finishing grad school, I was TAing for a couple much more politically minded faculty at the time. And so I was exploring kind of, was there a way in which politics and literature, maybe politics and the Bible was something that I was drawn towards. But I stumbled on this series of interviews that was done by Bill Kristol, Conversations with Bill Kristol, and one of his guests was this Shakespearean, Paul Cantor, who was very interested in political readings of Shakespeare. And there's something very, I encourage people to look those up. They're really fun conversations. I might have pick some beefs with some of the late Dr. Cantor's interpretation of some of the plays, but man, he had a really delightful, charming way of unpacking serious political thought that seemed to be at least under, not even super under the surface in the plays, and worth those kind of questions being worth asking of Shakespeare from an academic point of view. And so that was really fresh in my mind when I actually went to starting PhD studies, was the Paul Cantor stuff.
And you specifically cite a book, Shakespeare's Politics, by Alan Bloom and Harry Jaffa. How did they interpret the politics of Shakespeare? What did you glean from that book?
Yeah, so it's funny that work kind of kicked off a lot of political interest in reading Shakespeare, and so in some ways I'm almost hesitant to give it a ton of credit for the way that I have. I would point to other works, other little pieces of writing that both Jaffa and Bloom did later that helped me, I think, more than that particular book, but it certainly was opened some of the floodgates for a lot of their students. And Alan Bloom and Harry Jaffa were both students of Leo Strauss, a major mid-20th century political philosopher who we could talk about a little bit. I am not a Straussian expert by any means,
sure.
but his name carries a lot of interesting connotations and weight, especially in more right-wing academic circles. And so Jaffa and Bloom, they open that book talking about how they want to reintroduce or reinvigorate in Shakespeare a kind of, they call it naive form of criticism. That is to say, whereas many academics, this is especially true I think at the start of the 20th century, many academics, they sometimes put themselves in a box of assuming that distance over time, over centuries between ourselves and maybe the American founding, maybe Shakespeare. There's so much difference between those cultures, those socioeconomic situations that sometimes out of a reasonable humility,
you hear those as like biblical critiques as well.
Sure.
Yeah, same undertone.
Yeah, there are a lot of legitimate reasons why any academic should be humble reading the past, but I think Bloom and Jaffa wanted to say, look, there are timeless questions that, especially in their mode of thinking, go back to Plato and Socrates about how should we live a good human life? How should we live good human lives together in political communities? Is there a kind of life dedicated to the love and pursuit of wisdom that certain people are maybe called to or ought to try to live? What does it mean to be a great leader, a great ruler? And their sort of suggestion was a lot of people weren't asking those questions of Shakespeare, or if they were, it was often very historicized or historically contingent. That is, if there was some kind of political implication or red thread in a play, they would maybe sort of ask just the question, well, how did the politics of maybe Elizabethan England, like what political beef was going on with the actual
historical?
Very important. I would never dismiss that kind of work, but there is a kind of timelessness to some of the stuff going on in Shakespeare. And sometimes when he looks at English history or Roman history, that's not just like a sort of like skin almost for surface level paint for English politics in the 1590s, right? So just taking seriously, like, Shakespeare might actually be interested in bigger level questions. His plays might supply certain answers to that. That almost seems naive in a world where people are like, no, like real scholarship is keeping your head down and looking at
contextually and.
I think they helped correct, nudge scholarship, and a lot of people don't. A lot of mainstream guild Shakespeareans still don't take them that seriously, or still would say that some of the Straussian readings of Shakespeare are kind of marginal. But I think it was a helpful nudge. A lot of scholarship came afterwards that tried to reopen a conversation between Shakespeare and other great political thinkers across history.
Okay. Yeah, so let's get into the actual works of Shakespeare. And
Great.
it was custom in the age of Shakespeare, or when he was alive, to title plays after the reigning monarch of the time. And so I think it'd only be fitting if we were to bisect the questions into the periods under Queen Elizabeth I, being the first part of the plays being written, and then subsequently under King James I. So let's start with Queen Elizabeth. She's largely credited with sort of ameliorating some of the Catholic-Protestant divide in England. There was. I
wonder if the Catholics would agree in
well, it certainly was more of a compromise that put the Protestants, I think, on the longer end of the stick, certainly, and that was cemented, when King James took over. But with respect to the monarchy of Queen Elizabeth, where do we see a formal recognition of Shakespeare and his company by the royals? Was there something in particular that put him on the map with Queen Elizabeth?
Yeah, and I'm certainly not a great historian of some of the Shakespeare company questions, but his sort of collective acting troupe, I believe it's called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, originally, was certainly making a name for itself by the end of the 1590s. Was very, very popular, seemed to make a lot of profits for some of its main shareholders, and I think at least by, I want to say 1597, 98, because that's kind of like the two large decades of Shakespeare playwriting, at least that we are relatively confident about, are kind of 1590s and the 1600s, the first decade, since the last plays that he writes are almost certainly 1613, 1614, and he passes away 1616. It's kind of like this maybe 25-year period of a lot of activity. He has also a couple really important published poems, Venus Adonis and Rape of Lucrece, in I believe 93 and 94. But at least I think by the end of the 1500s, those last few years, Shakespeare has enough of a reputation that these like independent, one-off kind of sort of bootlegged publishing of some of his plays, these like quarto editions, individual plays, are being published with his name on it explicitly. So his name is selling these works. I remember a scholar suggested that very early after the first productions of the first part of Henry IV at Falstaff, that great comic lover of drink character from the Henry IV plays, that he was like a household name pretty early on. So at least by the end of the 1590s, and again, Elizabeth dies 1603, I think, is when James takes the throne. So certainly by the end of her life, he was a kind of a fairly popular name, and was making a decent amount of money, we think, from that. But of course, I think there's also that fascinating, in terms of Elizabeth herself, I'm not quite sure how often she saw Shakespeare plays, but there was that sort of interesting sub-history about how one of the uprisings that happened under her rule,
the Essex rebellion.
Yeah, that he thought it would be a great idea, I guess, to rally the troops, and I mean, it didn't seem like his rebellion actually took off much at all. It was sort of pretty quick.
It stopped pretty dead in its tracks.
But he thought it would be a cool booster thing to put on a production of Shakespeare's Richard II. Famously features a deposition of a questionable monarch that at least one source that was in Elizabeth's wider government claimed that she had reflected, know you not that I am Richard II. That this is maybe there was a
but you don't think Shakespeare really had much knowledge about what or who he was performing to and their motivations for that performance?
I don't think I've seen any evidence that he was like underwriting that particular performance, or that he would have. There's plenty of criticisms of both monarchical tendencies in government overall, as well as some characteristic English deficiencies, problems that English monarchs seem to repeat over and over, that you can identify reasonably in Shakespeare's plays. But I think it's a lot harder, and I would want to be a lot more careful saying, clearly he was anti-Elizabeth, or clearly he was, now maybe we can talk about Henry VIII as a play that I think does a remarkable job carefully, maybe dissecting is too strong a word, but carefully unpacking some of the problems of Henry VIII's rule, which was a lot more of a dicier subject to treat, and which I think my interpretation of that is more of a minority opinion.
Well, I think it deserves to be said that particularly with the historians and even playwriters of that time, anything pertaining to the royal bloodline must be treated with utmost care, and there are consequences for writing history that's maybe a little bit too condemning of a certain monarch in the lineage, and certainly from Elizabeth's point of view, she did have legitimate reason to be worried that a number of people viewed her as an illegitimate successor, and so someone like that is much more likely to read into just basic history that was being published at the time. She threw a guy in a tower for writing what she viewed as a historical account of Richard II, but that she believed was hiding some subversive messaging.
Yeah.
So she definitely took that concern to heart. But then the question then remains, what is the picture we're actually getting from these historians that dare talk about Richard II or Henry VIII? Is there any concern that there's this fear compromises their ability to write truthfully about these subjects?
Yeah, I certainly think there are seams in certain plays almost where you can see a kind of
trepidation.
Well, before getting to the trepidation part, I think there is genuine because one of the main things that James does is, at least for Shakespeare, is to elevate the Lord Chamberlain's men to be the King's men, to be actually a royally sponsored entity. And, of course we can talk about what kind of strings might have been attached to that, but Macbeth, I think, is one of those plays.
Well, we could switch to James now if you'd like.
No, I just think, does it compromise art? I mean, it certainly infuses the art with a character of there's not I don't see reckless abandon in Shakespeare as being some kind of polemicist that's trying to attack every institution in his
Sure.
day. I think if anything, Richard II might not have been a best choice for Essex. I think it is a really good, almost showing the beginning of the powder keg being lit of England, of what happens when a genuine, comprehensive sense of hereditary succession, when that goes out the window, when that's lost, England becomes radically destabilized, and sort of violence that's prophesied by a leading cleric at the end of Richard II happens. As awful as Richard II is as a king in many respects, I'm always struck by the way that play humanizes him, that somehow, in spite of his pettiness, his willingness to sort of stab his kindred in the back, taking John of Gaunt's stuff is such a, he's so almost matter of fact about it. It's how could we possibly have any sympathy for this guy by the end of the play? And yet when he's forcibly separated from his wife, when he kind of dies more like a man with a sword in his hand, in prison, even when he's actually losing the crown to his cousin, Shakespeare is remarkable at humanizing the costs of various political actions, but especially the kind of usurpations and civil unrest. And so I think that would be...
Who would you say Shakespeare regarded as more legitimate because Shakespeare was, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not the scholar on this, but he definitely seemed to believe in divine right of kings. At least he writes some plays in a way that seems supportive of that. But Richard II, obviously, he's the quote-unquote legitimate heir to the throne, but then, he is usurped by someone who's arguably more competent and, well, not even arguably, but would make for a better ruler. But is there something to be said about that, Shakespeare's belief in divine right and natural succession of kings?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's anything that makes me think clearly divine right is on the table. I think there's some really interesting explorations about whether or not natural sort of aristocracy is a kind of thing, whether like if you have noble blood, that makes you more likely to act in a kind of virtuous way, be more likely to be a leader. You see, especially in Cymbeline, is a play that really interrogates that question of if you are being raised in a court environment, is that good or bad? Is it? I think Shakespeare shows both in different ways. You have these characters who are very sharply attacking the decadence, the self-importance of courtly life.
That was one of Shakespeare's last plays, correct? That was
probably one of the hardest to date. I'm trying to think if we have an edition of it before the first folio is.
Because a lot of people don't know about that one. Why do you think that is?
It's a weird play. It's one of those that has a remarkable amount of action, kind of compressed very tightly in a way that, if not done well, is probably going to come off as a little unbelievable in some respects. I mean, you even have King Cymbeline himself at the end of the play, as all these plot threads are like resolving themselves really quickly. He's like, this is kind of crazy. Like my long lost sons are like back and my daughter is back. And like all these crazy things are happening. Jupiter himself has this theophany on stage where he appears. That's kind of wild. Like that's probably the craziest on stage divine appearance that we get in all of Shakespeare. It's hard to do well, and it also is one of those like there's a lot going on that if it's not done convincingly, not acted convincingly, it does run a risk of feeling unbelievable. I think would be one of the things I would say.
But you believe that it has particular significance with respect to Shakespeare's politics. Can you, what makes you believe that?
Yeah.
What have you found in
Sure. So my book that hopefully will be coming out this summer, 24. We can put the link in the description. When it comes out. I started with Cymbeline. I knew I wanted to write on the politics of these late plays that seem to be a little underappreciated for politics. And one of the things that stood out, I liked Cymbeline a lot, especially the character of Pisanio, this courtier, who seems to be like one of the most level-headed and loyal and capable advisor kind of characters that we see in all the plays. So he was really cool. I wanted to write about him more. But I was also struck by the fact that you have the Princess Imogen, so the kind of brief little plot, not mini summary, is a lot of the plot revolves around this royal couple, Imogen, Princess of England, set in around the time of Christ, so 2,000 years ago, ancient England. It's under the Roman sort of taxation, occupation. Yeah. And they want to maybe throw that off. King Cymbeline wants to maybe throw that off, and there's a little mini war that happens. But part of the main drama is his two sons disappeared long ago when they were infants, and he only has a daughter left. And she decided to marry a commoner, Posthumus, who was raised in the English court. And the king's furious about that.
His father was like a war hero, if I recall.
Yeah.
And even his name means after death, right?
Yeah. His mom died in childbirth. Lots of death.
Yeah.
Poor guy's only one left in the family. Brothers also died.
A staple of the period, it would seem.
I mean, so all that to say, the play revolves heavily around this married couple that seems to genuinely love each other, but they're both pretty fresh. They have this very over-the-top kind of romantic self-understanding. So as the husband goes off into exile, King Cymbeline's like, get out of here. Like, I'm going to try to separate you and maybe remarry my daughter to the intended guy, my stepson, by this evil, wicked kind of queen, second wife, it seems. And what's fascinating about all of this is Imogen, the princess, has this kind of little arc where, early on in the play, she's saying, man, it would be great if I wasn't a princess, because then maybe I could marry someone I actually loved without all this additional pressure. I wouldn't have the pressure of being the heir to the throne, and all that entails. So she kind of like, at one point says it would be so much greater to be a shepherd's daughter, a shepherdess. And it's just fascinating because in The Winter's Tale, another late play, Shakespeare gives us a princess who is being raised, she doesn't know she's a princess, by a shepherd. You have these images of almost a pastoral ideal of being free from political burdens and the kind of duties that come with that. But Imogen has this arc where she suffers tremendously. Her husband thinks she's betrayed him, had an affair. And through that suffering, she kind of grows into this person that is thinking more carefully about both her own sort of, let's say, private life, her own immediate circumstances, but also at one point she says in Act 3, Scene 4, at this kind of crisis moment, she talks about how she's going to brave what is to come with a prince's courage. Prince could be boy or girl. A princess's courage. And that's something I noticed, that diligence, a kind of lively willingness to fulfill one's duties, including duties you didn't really want.
Yeah.
It kept popping up over and over again. In The Tempest, another late play, Prospero calls his assistant, the sort of sprite Ariel, my diligence at one point. So I started getting interested in what are some of these virtues, these kind of like maybe stable traits or dispositions that these plays, you're watching them and they seem really desirable for people to have, especially for rulers to have, or people that are living around them, people who are in the court, so to speak.
Yeah.
What are those? Mm-hmm. And so Cymbeline was the beginning of looking at that. And it's not an exhaustive list. There are other important things, but I kind of came up with 5 that seemed to stick out and were both in Cymbeline, and then 3 of these other late plays I looked at. And those were so diligence, which is kind of a subset of another one, fidelity, which as I see it,
very aptly named character as well.
Yeah, Imogen disguises herself as Fidele, as a page boy, but the sort of being true to someone else, being honest, both in the sense of, well, not lying,
not just
to
in
them.
a marital sense, but maybe in a sense of being in a court or being loyal to a cause.
Exactly, it's a wider term, right? It has to do with fidelity, and I like that word in English. I think still captures faithfulness more.
Yes.
That broad sense of not just being sort of honest with your speech, but also pursuing the good for someone else, not just a spouse, but Pisanio talks about to be an honest servant, is to do what's actually good for his master, which might not be like following his like crazy order to like kill his wife, kill Imogen. It's like what this order that comes. So fidelity, diligence, fidelity. The 2 I was most really fascinated by, though, were patience, kind of suffering well without being excessively sort of angry, rage. It can be one response to suffering. And without being excessively despairing and kind of melancholic or deeply distraught is something you see in a lot of shapes. So patience and piety.
Yeah.
The kind of like both a belief that the gods exist, or there's some kind of divine providential order that's mostly friendly, and also a reliance on it. That look, you aren't gonna. At one point, Pisanio talks about his best plans are not coming to fruition. There are some things about political life that are either guided by fortune or God, but there is for a lot of these characters, especially in The Winter's Tale, Hermione, Catherine of Aragon, these two queens in Henry VIII and The Winter's Tale, they really do speak and act from a conviction that their deeds, and especially their deeds in the court, have a kind of cosmic significance and are that they will be vindicated by the divine. So piety, and the last one was clemency, kind of forgiveness, especially when you have a kind of authoritative role to be able to forgive or pardon someone. Those five were all over these late plays, and I tried to unpack how they helped us think through some of the political implications of the plays too.
Sure.
Yeah.
And under James, we also had King Lear. There's goodness in the world of King Lear, but there's also madness and death. And for many readers of that play, it's difficult to tell really what triumphs in the end. Some of the more postmodern scholars have their perspective on that, which is that there is not necessarily a meaning at the end of the day. But you seemed, when we talked about this previously, you made sort of an interesting point about the way that a lot of these tragedies sort of end and what the real symbolism of the tragedy is, which is to say, and forgive me if I'm butchering your interpretation, but that, sort of out of the ashes is where we arrive at order again. Would that be a fair assessment of what you were saying?
Yeah, I mean...
But we could talk about Lear specifically with that.
Sure. No, I think at the time I also mentioned it. I do get the sense that, maybe one of the reasons that at least high schools seem to have their kind of like, the sort of four great tragedies, Macbeth, Othello, Hamlet, Lear. There is this kind of fascination with darkness, with great tragedy, and a kind of almost like to tell the truth, to be honest, is to be honest about how awful human beings can be. And I think that's undoubtedly true in life in general and in these Shakespeare plays. But I do think that there's, I think the Western Christian tradition especially is more than capable of saying, yes, so like humanity does have these lows, especially Christian political thought. I think Augustine is a great representative of humanity does have these deep lows. But as I think you alluded to, it's striking how much education, how much development happens in a lot of characters in these really dark plays. Edgar certainly is one of the main bearers of this kind of tradition. I think Edmund, his bastard half-brother, who is the principal antagonist, I think is fair to say, for Lear, he brazenly tells the audience at the beginning of the play that it's great that he can work his deceptions on his credulous father and his brother, who's so far from doing harm that in his nature, he says a lot about human nature, his nature is so far from doing harm that he doesn't imagine anyone else will. And I think that's a central Shakespearean problem. It's true for Cymbeline, with Imogen and Posthumus, that there are essentially good people who are oftentimes bright, they have good intentions, and they just aren't aware of how much evil there is in the world, but especially in the duplicitousness of other people that they're interacting with. So disabusing people of that is a major Shakespearean theme. It's everywhere, even like Lady Macduff's wife, Lady Macduff, Macduff's wife in Macbeth, has that moment where she's about to be killed by Macbeth's forces, and she accuses herself of the silly idea that just because she has done no wrong, that she won't be a victim of the tyrant. So that is a real Shakespearean drumbeat. But look at what Edgar does. Edgar does learn. Edgar does take on this really theatrical appearance of old Tom, the kind of lunatic beggar, for protection, but also as a way to, in some cases, provide a sort of consolation, a kind of assistance of sorts to both Lear, who's his godfather, and his own father when he goes blind, when Gloucester loses his eyes. And so Edgar is this very dynamic character who's paying attention and who beats his brother in a one-on-one combat challenge at the end of the play. And also through that shares enough of his own story that moves his half-brother to a kind of repentance. And that's something also striking about Shakespeare, is the way that these like strange, I think to our ears almost unbelievable conversion sequences, changes of heart, crop up over and sometimes off stage, right? Like in Macbeth, is it which Thane is it? Or maybe it's Cawdor. I think it might have been Cawdor off stage. One of the sort of rebellious forces that Macbeth has helped subjugate is imprisoned, is going to be executed. And we hear about his execution off stage. And it's striking how much Shakespeare seems fascinated by this phenomena of, in the face of death, people turning for the good. I think Edmund is one of those characters. I think if we want, we could talk about Thomas Wolsey, Cardinal Wolsey, the arch-villain of the beginning of Henry VIII, has this remarkable conversion that we seem to be meant to take seriously. So I think that's another just way of contextualizing the darkness, is that Shakespeare does seem to show how the human heart is capable of these remarkable transformations, even away from a whole life of darkness, to something more, we could say, orderly. Maybe there's hope for more political order, but especially in the heart, that we're not just locked into meaningless darkness that can't be redeemed. I think there's enough in the Shakespearean corpus that complicates that quick assessment.
There seems to be, certainly a more modern fixation on the idea that subsequently after Queen Elizabeth, that we notice a major thematic change in Shakespeare's writing, becoming more tragic, more tragedy plays. But you don't seem to think that's as compelling of an argument as, because I mean there were tragedies prior to King James I, fair to say, but is there anything to be said about that, about there being more sort of focus on tyranny and sort of just these tragic ends? Maybe something contextually might inform. I mean, with respect to Macbeth, I mean, there are very clear lines, it seems, between that particular play and the gunpowder plot, which was foiled and led to, that's where like the Guy Fawkes, stuff came from. But it seemed to be, from what I had read about it, that it was, there were elements of that play which both flattered King James and seemed to dissuade the audience from the idea of, taking up some kind of action against, a legitimate sort of rule. Now, I want to be careful though, because we just had a long sort of bit about, why the history is important for informing some of this, but also like it's not everything that makes something like that. So what would you say with respect to Macbeth?
Well, I definitely think that Macbeth is a story that, so much of it boils down to just how perverse and cruel not only ambition can take you, because it's fascinating that Lady Macbeth, asserts repeatedly that in a certain way she has more ambition than Macbeth. But there's something so perverse about killing your own benefactor, killing your own kinsman, killing someone who, not just from a general kind of abstract, well, don't kill people or don't kill the king, but like you have these additional ties, rational ties, reasons why Macbeth, even in his own conscience, is racked by guilt for perverting what is a reasonable claim on his allegiance, on his gratitude.
Yeah, he's haunted.
And that's important to politics. I mean, that's a reason why Malcolm's restored order, his first action is a kind of beneficence, to elevate the sort of Scottish nobility to a new rank that they didn't have before. You could say that's just expedience, and there's some interesting things about Malcolm's character that show maybe he's not this, great Christian prince that Edward the Confessor is alluded to being off stage, that he's, in his exile, Malcolm has been learning from Edward the Confessor, this saintly king. Maybe that's not Malcolm, but there's certainly a sense that that we have an offstage vision of what kingly rule could be in a high way, this idea of a king being a healer, a literal healer, which James was fascinated with. Could the king have kind of like literal heal you by touch or contribute to that?
It seemed to certainly appeal to his interest in some of the more mystical, supernatural. I mean, there's witches and so.
I would say there's nothing in that play, as much as the modern mind tends to like dismiss that, well, that's a bunch of nonsense. And to be sure, the English court under Elizabeth and under James was kind of fascinated with the occult and like sort of witchcrafty stuff.
Yeah.
I don't see there being anything in Macbeth that is like, wants you to just dismiss all that out of hand. If anything, I take Banquo's thoughts really seriously. Well, you have to sift the spirits. Like, evil spirits can actually maybe predict the future in some cases. And Macbeth's unwillingness to rationally and with his friend talk about what's going on is a problem. At least twice, maybe thrice, he tells Banquo, yeah, let's talk about this more later. Let's talk about this more later. He never does, that we see. So Macbeth is an interesting tragedy that at a minimum, I think, makes us want to take, hopefully, I think it's a reasonable reaction to take seriously the need for discourse and discussion in politics, to have good counselors. Duncan at one point says, when he's just heard about the offstage conversion of his executed enemy, he's like, wow, there's no art to reading the mind's construction in the face. I guess you just can't really know what people are thinking about. Oh, hi, Macbeth, like, you did a great job in battle. I'm going to give you a bunch of honors, you know? It's kind of, I think, kind of humorous, but you can't just abdicate the difficulty of trying to discern, trying to get a reasonable bead on people's motivations, on whether or not they're trustworthy. That is a hard task, but it's an important task. And I think Macbeth is if nothing else, a suggestion you should do that seriously. And I guess in terms of its political implications, to stay with that a little bit more, I'm struck by how cool it is that Shakespeare's tyrants are different. And even the depiction of madness, I mean, like Lear's madness seems pretty legit, pretty believable.
Yeah, pretty clinical.
Whereas Old Tom's is, you can see the seams a little bit. Ophelia's is one thing, Hamlet's not so much. The tyrants are different. I mean, we have in Macbeth a partially Christianized conscience. Right? He's so wrapped up in, he's just killed Duncan. And the guards, semi-asleep, they're basically given a lot of alcohol by Lady Macbeth. They
right.
start sort of mumbling prayer in their sleep, I think it is, and Macbeth says, "Why could I not say amen to their prayer?" Like, he's like racked with this deep knowledge of this super added reason as to why what he's done is so awful, and that's not really there in like Richard III. Richard III, we hear later on, is unable to sleep from some scruple, but Richard is a much more early on, very clear, tells us he's hardened in his ways. He wants to bring about a lot of horrible things for a self-seeking way, and Macbeth's just not like that. So we have these different studies in human motivations. Leontes in The Winter's Tale, a king who goes crazy almost in terms of suspecting his wife for adultery for basically nothing, and does all these cruel, horrible things. A different kind of tyrant. And we can learn different things, I think, from those different modes of tyranny, of what does it mean to rule for one's self-interest. I have less of a handle on, I think, Macbeth particularly, but like at a minimum, again, there's this lack of self-knowledge in Macbeth the Tyrant, where he just is not complimented by he doesn't have good friends, he doesn't have good people. Leontes in his tyranny, his court kind of resists him a lot and does not go along with his craziness. Even Richard III has to convince people artfully to go along with him. Macbeth is just kind of isolated, and when you got Lady Macbeth next to a guy he's great on the battlefield, but he's a lot less put together internally, yelling at like Banquo's ghost. Like, that's just not basic, kind of political decorum 101. Like, you're going through something like that, like, don't act it out in front of everyone. We see that in Coriolanus too. There are certain characters that just don't have self-possession. And his growing into self-possession sort of is this very twisting, hardening of his heart that maybe could have been averted by better counselors, better friends, and more openness to discourse and discussion. And let's think about this. For him, he seems to conflate a kind of manly action with getting rid of thought, getting rid of reflectiveness, and that's a certain way in which almost the tyranny is in his own soul, first and foremost, and then it acts out all these horrible things on Scotland.
Yeah. Well, let's switch over to talk about some of the literary devices. You identify one, and this is a quote I have from you. Ironic ignorance elicits our own desire for knowledge of the truth over opinion and ignorance. What is ironic ignorance in the context of Shakespeare's plays, and why is it useful for readers?
Good. So I think one of the main things that comes to my mind is a great example of characters on stage in the play being ignorant of something. They don't know something is happening, but the audience does. And so there's this kind of ironic distance between our gaze and our understanding and theirs. One great example of that is of course, the fact that when Romeo commits suicide, we know what he doesn't know, that Juliet's not dead at that time. And that's both a deeply sort of tragic thing. It amplifies his bad decision making. But it also, if we are drawn in as an audience to root for him, to root for the main character's good, to desire their good, I think it's a natural thing people do for protagonists. If we spend time with characters, we are interested in them. We want better things to happen to them generally. Then we want them to find the truth. We hope, oh gosh, if only you could see, like just look down and wait a little while.
Or even the moment in Macbeth, which you just talked about, where Duncan shows up at the house and they're talking about that guy who converted, and the audience knows he's going to get whacked.
For sure. So there's all kinds of moments of this, but I think there are particular moments where characters are not only ignorant about sort of major circumstances like an assassination attempt in the works, but sometimes they're even ignorant of the way that, of themselves, of their own inconsistencies. I mentioned kind of self-knowledge being this like drumbeat in Shakespeare. The moment you start looking for it, it's everywhere. Regan, one of Lear's wicked daughters, right, says that right off the bat, that's one of her dad's main flaws. I think she's right, that he hath but slenderly known himself is one of Lear's flaws, a lack of self-knowledge. One example of this playing out in ironic ignorance then, and I think in the book I kind of refer to it as a sort of self-measurement, is when you have a character like Posthumus Leonatus in Cymbeline, the commoner that married the princess and is now in exile. He has this moment where he's been convinced by the villain, Iachimo, that his wife did in fact sleep with Iachimo, that she betrayed him in England. And
he shows him a token or something like that.
It was a ring that was their kind of one of their love tokens that that Iachimo stole from her artfully. And Posthumus loses it, flies off the handle, wants to burn everything to the ground, and
kind of reads like Othello a little bit too.
Yeah, oh, definitely. No, it's these kind of cuckold plots are definitely something Shakespeare stays with. We see Much Ado About Nothing. It's in Winter's Tale.
He loved the fidelity sort of
Othello.
Inquisition.
Well, that's one of the cool things about these late plays is you can almost think about them. You can roughly characterize them. It's like, what if the events of Othello happen? What if this horrible, maddening betrayal happens? Is there any way out? Is there any way that you don't get dead Desdemona, right? Are there alternatives? That's one way of reading these romances that kind of have, especially the Winter's Tale, that had this kind of tragic initial arc. Like you'd almost take the first half of The Winter's Tale and look at it as a kind of compressed tragedy. But it's a romance. It has this kind of, it has death, but it has a kind of new life that comes about. There's something in, but to go back to Cymbeline, to wrap up that thread. So Posthumus, he's losing it, and he goes on this like very misogynistic rant about how women are so mutable. They're so changing and fickle, and that's their main vice. He blames all of humanity's problems on just women. And it's striking. I think there are a number of clues within that scene and earlier things that actually one of the most mutable, fickle characters in Cymbeline is, at least at first, is Posthumus. He changes his mind multiple times about, no, I believe my wife, like this is BS, like there are plausible explanations for how you got this ring. Like, oh my gosh, she betrayed me, she's the worst, no, actually, like he hums
he's what he describes, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that kind of like, when a character articulates a certain standard for human conduct and then is like clearly blowing it themselves by things that you could witness in the play, that's another form where...
It sounds like a handful of politicians throughout...
I have no idea what you could be describing.
So we don't have too much time remaining, but I wanted to switch gears a little bit
Sure.
and go into Saint or Sir Thomas More, which, depending on what side of the fence you're on with that. But is there anything else that you'd like to add about Shakespeare, either devices or other plays? Because we didn't get to talk about Henry at all. But anything you'd like to add with that discussion?
Oh, just that...
well, actually, let me ask you something. Because
please.
There clearly seems to be, and we touched on this a little bit at the start, but there are some ways that Shakespeare could be better read and interpreted. And it seems very clear that, and even on the way over here, we talked about sort of the problem with the current standard of just academic rigor, that people just kind of, they go along with the first guy that wrote his, opinion on the significance of some of these plays, and now we're dealing with things like AI and ways that make forming your own mind with respect to critical thinking more difficult. Almost impossible. I can't imagine being in a high school environment trying to read Shakespeare while also knowing I have a tool that can just give me some postmodern's view on it, so that I don't even
summarize
have to
it for
put
me.
the work in it.
That's just as
How
good,
do we fix that problem?
Yeah. Well, specifically the problem of Shakespeare being increasingly hard to just access, to understand, and to teach.
It's already a challenge, and people. Sorry to interrupt again, but people have described it like it's something that must be formed in order for you to actually engage with Shakespeare. It's like a language where the more plays of Shakespeare you read, the easier it is for you to decipher a lot of this.
Definitely.
You would agree with that?
Oh, yeah. And I think, every case is different. I do think that one of the most helpful, just general guiding principles for especially teaching and sharing Shakespeare, I would say is the basic Aristotelian notion. You progress from the things you know more to the things you know less. And so it almost does feel like there's this giant gulf between ourselves and the language of Shakespeare, the language of Thomas More. And that's worth not glossing over. It's worth not, and I see this, I think, too often in the experience of my friends who teach in classical schools that want to take these things more seriously, and they want to have their kids appreciate the treasury of our tradition, is to not just frantically give them these things to check the boxes so that we can tell the parents, well, we read these 8 Shakespeare plays, wow, that's great, but to genuinely get them to enjoy it, I think you have to build that bridge between us and the language, and I think some of that involves actually giving students previous opportunities, both to encounter great, eloquent, advanced sentence structure English, and that could be great speeches from even the American founding era. We have a tradition of some pretty great rhetoric that, if habitually given and unpacked with students, can both increase their vocabulary, but also sort of prepare their mind for more advanced kind of contours and rhythms and musicality in English. I think a really cool thing I had an occasion to do was work with some middle schoolers, early high school kids with Chaucer in Middle English, and that was its own little challenge. But the mind has an incredible ability to adapt to more musical forms of English. And I think there's similar possibilities with Shakespeare if we not only provide, hopefully, intermediary forms of again, advanced English grammar and sentence structure to students, but also I'm increasingly a big fan of adaptation, of preparing students' minds for certain great stories and great plots through simpler adaptation. Whether that's, I remember as a kid stumbling on like a Shakespeare comic book that was really cool, that I really enjoyed. There's an understandable desire among academics, especially, like, give them the primary text, give them the real thing. And yes, that's good.
Yeah, well, the process of unpacking, it really can vary from work to work, and it's not always obvious, the best way to approach some of that. But yeah, I would agree with that starting with sort of a basic understanding of, first of all, like, I think most Americans have a pretty abysmal understanding of English history, which I think is more significant than we probably realize. I think maybe starting with sort of the basic building blocks, a Shakespeare comic, as you say, or just getting an idea for what the times looked like, what were things that people were talking about, what was the religion, very basically, and then kind of working our way up toward being the ones interrogating it and trying to find answers to some of the questions posed in it. Because ultimately, you would agree that that's what Shakespeare would want ultimately, is for people to finish the play and converse amongst themselves.
Yes.
And debate and arrive at some kind of a conclusion as to what the moral message was at the end of the day. I find all of that really important, and it'll be an uphill climb, I think, to certainly rework the way that things are taught in these institutions, and but I think it's good to be optimistic about those things. There certainly is a desire to know about this material among young people still. So let's switch gears with a quote to wrap this part of it up.
Sounds good.
I die the king's good servant and God's first. Thomas More is an important figure in your own intellectual formation. Did Shakespeare hold him in high regard? I mean, I think he based his Richard III play on the history of Richard III by Thomas More. Is that accurate?
That's right. Yeah. No. It was into the sort of Holland Chronicle tradition. You have them lifting with attribution, but copy pasting at least one version of Thomas More's unpublished history of Richard III, which was a big source for a lot of other thinkers on the time. There's a whole Ricardian, Richard III apologist group online that is very, very happy to tell you about the historical inaccuracies of More's Richard III. But it's frankly one of the coolest works.
Let's back this up because I want to make sure that everyone watching this is on like the same level of like basic understanding. So briefly describe St. Thomas More and his involvement with Henry VIII, obviously, and if you could just briefly summarize that.
Sure. So Thomas More, right, a lawyer, civic official in London, right, end of the 1400s, and then his political career really is mostly spans. He enters the royal service in, I want to say, 1516. Is a counselor to Henry VIII. becomes Chancellor of England. He holds a few different royal offices on the way up, but he's knighted and he's Chancellor of England, basically the highest sort of civil office under the crown. In 1529, I believe it is, until 1532 when he resigns. And this is, his life saw both a resurgence of humanistic learning in England. One scholar told me he might have been the third person in England to have learned Greek, which he learned both because, he's a very devout man, very devout Roman Catholic. He wanted to read the Church Fathers in the original language, but he also wanted to read Lucian, one of the great Greek satirical authors, known for having both a brilliant mind, a lawyerly mind, but also a great wit, great humor. Even his enemies commented on him maybe cracking jokes too much in serious situations. But he was known for being a genuine model civic servant who deeply loved the English people and deeply loved their traditions of law and self-government, which granted had been marred by the fact that he was born in the end of the War of the Roses. He was born at a time where England's nobility had been slaughtering itself for the better part of the 1400s. But More was someone who also believed that the English had a particular character that was amenable to self-discipline, self-restraint, including of its leaders. And I think he saw his public career, but especially his constant advising of Henry VIII at that crucial period when in the 1520s, Lutheran ideas were in England, was a source of civil unrest. Even though Henry VIII wasn't explicitly all that Protestant in his theology, the marriage question, his desire to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and ultimately Mary Anne Boleyn, partially out of conscience scruples about his marriage, but also wanting a male heir. Thomas More finds himself at the center of this controversy, and especially
his life reads like a Shakespeare play in a lot of ways.
Yes. Which is unsurprising then that Shakespeare contributed. The scholarly consensus is that Shakespeare contributed two of the most essential scenes to a unpublished, unstaged play on Thomas More's life that was written either the end of the 1580s or the early 1590s. Didn't pass the Elizabethan censor. They were like, no, you got to cut this out. You got to do this, and
right.
We don't believe it was ever staged, but in Shakespeare's lifetime. But Shakespeare both contributed some really powerful things to this play that makes Thomas More look pretty good, as well as in Henry VIII there seems to be the character of Thomas More as the Chancellor seems to be another indication that Shakespeare had both some literary, as you mentioned with Richard III, a literary debt to him, as well as probably has some signs of a favorable approach to his legacy.
I think we've got about 10 more minutes, but I just briefly wanted to touch on some other points regarding More, because there are some pretty serious charges leveled against More online, whether it's from politically the left side of things or even the right side of things. Some people say he was a communist or would have embraced more of a collectivist kind of thing. Where do people get that idea, and what would you say to that?
Sure. So that typically comes from certain readings of his Utopia, his kind of great work that he initially published in 1516, that purports to tell, or we are told by a visiting European that went to this island that had, among other things, no real private property at all. And Utopia has been a notoriously difficult work to interpret. Personally, I come from a school that sees plenty of irony throughout that work, and frankly, Thomas More as a whole is a lovely writer because of the way he inflects certain things with irony, with humor, with not everything is what it seems. But there have been some authors who assume that because Utopia, which literally means nowhere,
I think the Soviet Union actually honored Thomas More.
He's on a statue of, I believe, I forget if it's like an obelisk, but it's purporting to list certain proto-contributors to the communist cause. I think there are a lot of sound reasons to think that More was very capable of seriously entertaining ideas and philosophic notions he didn't agree with in that text. And I think that the sort of second book of Utopia that actually describes the utopian practices is chock full of fascinating puzzles for readers to think over. Is this actually good? Is this, the title of Utopia is sort of on the best state of a commonwealth. Is this the best commonwealth we could have that would, purportedly almost never go to war, but also employ mercenaries under horrible conditions when it fights wars? Thomas More gives you a lot of puzzles to sort out, and I think a lot of people have been, I don't say duped, but taken a surface level reading. Whereas I think it's by design, that work especially is supposed to invite serious deliberation and debate about whether or not this is actually ideal.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is an important question. I think that ties together some themes from Shakespeare, but also, I wanted to touch on Machiavelli briefly because he's someone who you talk about a lot. This is sort of a serious question that informs some of the more, modern interpretations of even Shakespeare, I think.
Yeah.
Machiavelli levels the charge. Can Christianity govern earthly politics?
Yeah.
Is it possible to be both worldly in a way that is just without foregoing the prospect of an afterlife? What do you think about that?
What do I think about that? Wow. Well,
we're getting into the philosophy now.
I mean, I would far be it from me to dismiss the careful thinking, and especially thinking about justice, done by certain classical non-Christian writers that didn't clearly believe in an afterlife, or at least a lot of their thought didn't depend on that. I'm thinking especially of Aristotle. I'm thinking of almost certainly Cicero probably is in that category, but maybe that's debatable. But I do think that it's too easily assumed. Like, there are a lot of readers of Shakespeare, as you point out, that would assume if you care about ultimately heaven and a divine reward after this life, that you're likely to neglect the things of this life. I think Shakespeare shows that can in fact be a possibility, that we do see people who do that. And sometimes it's just a sort of accident of it's unfortunate the circumstances that like a Henry VI finds himself in, where he doesn't have the temperament really to rule, and he certainly would rather just kind of be maybe a monk instead.
A Stoic or something, yeah.
But does that mean that all Christians are in the pattern of Henry VI? Shakespeare certainly shows otherwise. I think both those two great queens I mentioned earlier that I write about, Catherine of Aragon, Hermione in The Winter's Tale, both of them clearly see not only their life in general, but their political actions, their actions in the court as being permeated by a cosmos, a universe in which they are stewards of not only their lives, but their stations, that they need to do right by, because there have been gifts from God that they will be held accountable for. And so I think that far from just writing off all of Christianity, all of pious Christianity as a distraction from this world, I think Shakespeare shows us. I mean, Catherine's first appearance on stage is a very political act. She petitions the king for taxation relief. And Cardinal Wolsey, who is certainly not a good Christian in the play, has imposed upon the people, has snuck in. She's doing political act at the very outset. So I certainly think that Shakespeare is aware of a way in which, especially if you think that God will ultimately vindicate you, as Hermione and Catherine think, maybe not even in this lifetime, that's actually a really strong source of patience, of a willingness to endure the sometimes calamities. You can do everything right and still not convince someone, still fail politically, still not get what you want in this world. But if you're living for more than just this world, you might actually be more willing to put up with that, to suffer through those indignities, so that, among other things, maybe your children will live in a better political situation. So there are certain ways in which both Christianity and I think serious piety of a broader kind, Shakespeare dramatizes as having some really salutary political significance. And in fact, that's a kind of ancient problem is politics does seem kind of awful in the sense that it's really burdensome. It's typically not all that rewarding. And again, you could be a Thomas More, you can be a Cicero, you can do a lot of things right and be executed by the regime that you purported to serve all your life, right? Yeah. It's hard to convince brilliant people to go into politics if it's very unrewarding. And so I wouldn't say Shakespeare is saying, see, this is why religion's really useful, you know, in a kind of utilitarian or instrumentalizing way. Yeah. But he dramatizes ways in which Machiavelli's criticism of the enervating problem of Christianity doesn't have the last word in a lot of cases. There are more examples in which especially a Christian idea of stewardship, of politics as a kind of stewardship, motivates you to care more deeply and more intensely about the people who you are called to love and serve.
Yeah, certainly. I think that was an excellent way to wrap this. Is there anything else you would like to add out there?
Sure.
Whether it's with respect to what we just discussed with Shakespeare or Thomas More. Any advice to maybe some young students out there trying to decipher Shakespeare?
Yeah, I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't.
Or book recommendations. That would
of
work
course,
as well.
yeah. I would be to my benefactors in the past, both so the work of John Alvis, who passed away a few years ago, a great reader of Shakespeare. Shakespeare's Understanding of Honor is, I think, his sort of seminal work on Shakespeare's politics that I highly recommend people check out. There are certainly some little things to quibble with, but his taking seriously political questions with Shakespeare in a range of plays knocks it out of the park. Shakespeare's Understanding of Honor. But I'd also be remiss if I didn't shout out my current benefactor, the Center for Thomas More Studies that I work for at the University of Dallas. So it's thomasmorestudies.org is our current website. We have a host of resources there, including a lot of critical editions for free of More's works. I would say if you're interested, he's Richard III. It's a little challenging, but if I could shout out almost any of Thomas More's works, that's a delightful one, as well as we're currently in Holy Week, approaching the end of Lent. If you have time to check out his Sadness of Christ, a kind of biblical commentary reflection on Christ's time in Gethsemane. Another masterwork, he wrote it in the Tower of London, but it really gets, it opens up.
I didn't know that. Oh.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy, but it's a great little vehicle for, or opening the door to More's moral dynamism, that kind of sense in which Thomas More was very attentive to the way that life is a journey. It involves dynamic changes and hopefully potential for growth as well as regression, but growth in the moral life and the spiritual life. And that's just such a timeless insight, to not put ourselves or others in a box, in a snapshot morally as to who they are. And that's a great work for beginning that conversation.
Well, excellent. Nicolas, thanks so much for joining me today.
Aaron, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah, it's great.
Good
All
stuff.
right, well, we will link relevant Thomas More Center or Nick.
Or the book. It's going to be called,
Yeah.
The title changed, so I'm trying to remember now. It's Political Wisdom in Late Shakespeare, A Way Out of the Wreck. That subtitle comes from a line in Henry VIII, but it'll be coming out with Lexington Books in summer of 24.
Excellent. All right, keep us posted.
Sir,
Thanks
will
so
do.
much.
Thank you.